February 15th, 1944, New Ireland, New Guinea. As Navy Lieutenant Nathan Gordon sat on the tarmac aboard his PBY Catalina, the Arkansas Traveler, he couldn't shake the terrible image of men hurled into shark-infested waters. He trembled as nearly 50 B-25 Mitchell bombers and A-20 Havocs of the 5th Air Force climbed in front of him into the New Guinean sky. They were headed for Kavieng, a heavily fortified Japanese aircraft assembly hub that had to be destroyed. Gordon knew these men were flying into some of the worst FLAK in the entire Pacific, and as expected, the first frantic mayday calls came quickly. Over the radio, Gordon heard the entire operation unraveling. Bombers spiraling out of control, men jumping into flames, Japanese gunners mowing down survivors in the water. Most of those bombers would not be making it back. Gordon ignited his engine. It was his job to go grab these fallen men before the sharks did. The bomb bay doors yawned open, spilling 2 tons of 500-pound bombs that tumbled downward, aimed at Japanese warehouses just 100 feet below in Kavieng. Second Lieutenant William J. Smith clenched the tiller as his Mitchell B-25D, named Piss on It, ripped the ground with searing 50-caliber machine gun fire. Then it hit. A blast of flak tore through the left engine, jolting the airframe so violently it felt like the bomber might come apart right then and there. Black smoke billowed inward. Flames threatened to swallow the entire wing. Smith yelled for co-pilot Eugene Benson to hold steady as he wrestled with the Lux fire extinguisher. But before he could smother the fire, another burst of shrapnel shredded the Tokyo auxiliary tank. The 200-gallon fuel reserve exploded into a 6-foot blowtorch, spewing flames into the hull. The pilot flying the B-25 immediately to Piss on Its left saw the scene and mumbled, quote, "I'll never see those guys again." For Smith, it was clear they had to ditch in the ocean now. Those shark-infested waters were now their last shot. But to his shock, Benson pulled the yoke back and shouted, quote, "We have to gain altitude." Smith thought Benson had lost his mind. Their left wing was about to burst. An acrid stench hit Smith's nostrils. Smith grabbed his yoke and barked at Benson, saying they had to put the aircraft down now. Benson braced his tiller even more vehemently. The 2 men wrestled for command of their crippled aircraft. Finally, Benson snapped out of it. With a sharp gasp, he let go. Smith seized his chance, forcing the nose into a steep dive. The Pacific was coming in fast, promising that this ordeal was far from over. Shark-infested or not, the water would have to do. Smith forced his focus onto the waves ahead. He cut the right engine, fighting to keep the nose up as the bomber plunged toward the sea. With the hydraulics gone, the flaps were useless. But luck, or something like it, intervened. The aircraft dropped into the trough of a wave instead of smashing headfirst into a wall of water. Still, the impact was brutal, a crushing jolt that almost tore the bomber apart. But the airframe held, wreck barely floating. Then came the fire. Aviation fuel poured from the torn fuselage, flames racing across the water's surface, curling closer to the aircraft. Time was running out. The hatch above the co-pilot's seat was the cockpit's most direct escape route. Benson wasted no time, ripping off his harness and lunging upward to shove it open. He and navigator Holly Rushing scrambled for the exit, trampling over Smith, who was still strapped in his seat. Smith twisted around, his eyes darting to where he had last seen tail gunner Gross. Water surged through the Mitchell, and the cold Pacific rose fast. Smith threw himself out of his seat, desperate to find Gross, only to spot the lower fuselage hatch forced wide open by the crash's impact. Gross had been wrenched out, suctioned straight into the ocean's void. With no time to mourn, Smith hauled himself through the escape hatch. He clambered onto the nose of the Mitchell, every nerve on edge, but what he saw froze him. The sea all around the sinking airframe was on fire. He could dive beneath the burning aviation fuel, but how far could he swim before having to emerge? Then, in an instant, the plexiglass nose shattered with a deafening explosion. The blast hurled Smith off the wreckage, slamming him into the water. The shockwave seared his face, the agony cooled only by the salt water that immediately stung his skin. He surfaced, gasping and disoriented, just as Benson and Rushing swam toward him. The 3 survivors kicked frantically away from the wreck, fearing another explosion. Their May West life vests kept them afloat, but that was their only advantage. Smith's mind raced as he realized his left leg had been torn open, bleeding into shark-infested waters. They were a mile out from Kavieng, with no raft, no food, and no water. The tide might carry them to shore, but that meant capture and certain torture. Drifting further into the open sea wasn't much better. Above them, the skies were filled with the roar of bombers. Fires blazed on the horizon as plumes of smoke rose from Kavieng. The air raid had been a resounding success. Ships smoldered in the harbor, and explosions still boomed across the island. This brought little consolation to the stranded aviators. Smith and his crew could only cast desperate glances skyward, praying for rescue. Then came their chance. A formation of B-25 bombers roared overhead, and the survivors screamed and waved, their voices hoarse with hope. Relief turned to horror in seconds. The bombers' gunners opened fire at the stranded men. 50 caliber rounds ripped into the water around them, forcing the men to dive, only to be betrayed by their life vests, which stubbornly kept them afloat. Bullets whizzed past, their trajectory terrifyingly close. Somehow, miraculously, no one was hit. They'd been mistaken by U.S. gunners as Japanese sailors from one of the sunken ships. But their nightmare wasn't unique. Across the burning expanse of the Bismarck Sea, other American aviators from the same raid fought their own battles for survival, between the jaws of sharks and the merciless grasp of Japanese POW camps. Captain William J. Cavoli led 3 B-25s through the chaos, his co-pilot, George H. Braun, at his side. Suddenly, the right engine exploded, a direct hit. Flames engulfed the wing and fuselage, as aviation fuel sprayed fire across the aircraft. Cavoli and Braun wrestled with the controls, clearing palm trees and shoreline by mere feet. Just 600 yards out, the B-25 slammed into the ocean, skipping once before crashing to a halt in a towering spray. Water tore through the shattered nose, ripping fabric from the navigator's legs. Braun deployed the life raft, and the crew clawed free of the sinking wreck. Miraculously, all 6 survived, bloodied, battered, and desperate, paddling furiously away from the doomed Mitchell. They were frighteningly close to the shore, and it was only a matter of time before they were captured. Meanwhile, on Langamak Bay Airfield, 24-year-old Lieutenant Nathan Gordon was briefed on his role in the ongoing operation. His orders were to provide search and rescue coverage off the coast of Kavieng during the low-altitude bombing raid conducted by the 5th Air Force. The brass expected a high number of downed bombers, and he was to be their lifeline. As a rescue man for the Navy, Gordon had done this dozens of times, even at his young age, but as he heard the parameters of his mission, he couldn't help but feel something was different about this particular day. Back in the air, not far from Cavoli's crash site, another Mitchell called Gremlin's Holiday was on fire, and pilot Edgar R. Cavan knew their odds were not good. Japanese incendiary shells tore through the fuselage, ripping open the belly and igniting the auxiliary fuel tank. Staff Sergeant David McCready, perched in the top turret, was thrown back by the explosion, the wind carving his face raw as the fire flared up from below. In the chaos, Captain Robert Huff, a passenger along for the ride who wanted to see combat, fought the spreading inferno with Staff Sergeant Lawrence Herbst. It was no use. The fire roared like a living thing. Second Lieutenant Jeb Kirkland shouted, quote, "We have to ditch." Technical Sergeant Fred Arnett gripped McCready tightly in the radio compartment, cradling his burned comrade as the bomber stalled. The B-25 plunged nose first into the sea. The impact knocked Arnett and McCready unconscious. The crew survived, barely. Huff's spine was fractured. Arnett's shoulder shattered, his face slashed open. McCready's burns and broken ankle screamed with every movement. Above them, the rest of the squadron's B-25 circled, dropping bright yellow rafts into the empty sea. They were alive, for now. At 11 a.m., 24-year-old Lieutenant Nathan Gordon received the first confirmation that his day was about to spiral into madness. Even from his distant position, the rising columns of smoke over Kavieng were unmistakable. Radio transmissions crackled with grim reports. Crashed aircraft, crews in the water, aviators stranded. The call for Gardenia 6, Gordon's call sign, came through the Army radio again and again, but Gordon was already in motion, guiding his lumbering PBY Catalina, the Arkansas Traveler, toward the burning township. He scanned the water, searching for life amid the wreckage. Suddenly, a streak of yellow-orange caught his eye, the telltale dye of desperate aviators. Oil slicks marred the water's surface as Gordon angled the Catalina lower, knowing what he had to do. The touchdown was brutal. The Traveler slammed into the waves, jolting its crew. Rivets popped along the 16-year-old hull, seawater spraying through new gaps. Gordon grit his teeth and taxied forward, plowing through a grim debris field. Then something emerged from the wreckage, a deflated raft, lifeless. Gordon shook his head, frustration etched on his face as he throttled back, the Catalina lifting away from the empty sea. But hope flared moments later. From the sky, Captain Tony Chiap's B-25, Old Baldy, spotted the Catalina. Hand signals and relays from P-47s guided Gordon toward Kavieng's wreck. He followed the Mitchell through smoke-streaked skies, circling low over survivors in the water. Gordon's second landing was smoother, but now the stakes were higher. 2 rafts floated in the pitching waves, tethered together, survivors barely clinging on. Standard rescue procedures were useless here. The Japanese shore batteries had locked onto them. Shells erupted nearby, sending sprays of seawater skyward. Gordon ordered, quote, "Get a line to them," his voice sharp and commanding over the chaos. The crew hurled a rope, and the aviators snagged it on the first try. The Traveler's forward momentum became a new threat. The spinning props churned dangerously close, the drag from the line pulling hard against the weakened survivors. Gordon barked, quote, "Cut the line." The rope snapped away, and Gordon knew he had to shut the engines down. The silence that followed was unnerving, broken only by the slap of waves and the distant shriek of artillery. With the engines off, Traveler rocked violently in the swells as the crew prepared for the rescue. Ensign Jack Kelly positioned himself at the port blister, ready to pull men aboard. Paul Drameau, the strongest among them, braced himself to heave the oil-soaked bodies into the Catalina. Machine gun fire sprayed the water, closer and closer. The aircraft bucked and pitched over the waves. The first survivor reached the blister, barely conscious and coated in oil. Drameau locked his arms around him, hauling him inside. One by one, they wrestled Kavieng's crew aboard. Injuries made it a desperate struggle. Huff and McCready were limp, their wounds severe. Kavieng, the last of the group, collapsed through the blister window, gasping for breath as the rafts were cut loose. The sea exploded around them. Gordon's eyes shot to the shoreline. Artillery was closing in fast. There was no time. He tried to start the engines. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, whoomph! Black smoke belched from the engines as they sputtered to life. Gordon pushed the throttle forward. There were more men in the water. It had now been over 2 hours since Smith, Benson, and Rushing had gone into the water. The yellow-orange dye from the stain canisters rigged to their vests had long since run out. The dye was designed to give visibility to rescuers and serve as a shark repellent. The high swells provided a good vantage point when the survivors were carried to the crest, but upon sliding down into a trough, there was no visibility at all. Just ominous, shark-shaped shadows in the water. Suddenly, the 3 heard P-47 Thunderbolt fighters approaching. Quickly, they took the chrome mirrors attached to their life vests and flashed them toward the fighters. The fighters dove in, circling the stranded, with no ill intent this time. The Traveler followed the P-47's directions to the 3 bobbing figures on the water. Gordon was too close to Kavieng, and the enemy had duly noted his presence. As he moved toward the water and a third landing, he did so through a hail of tracers. The crew had taken pencils and inserted them into the sprung rivet holes, intentionally breaking them off in an effort to plug the leaks. The rocking ocean banged the 3 against the side of the hull, but they came in quickly, sliding roughly over the blister window's coating. Smith joined the increasingly cramped group inside. The PBY's engine sprang to life. The Traveler lurched forward as geysers rose in her wake from Japanese gunfire. Gordon knew that a few more seconds on the rescue scene would have spelled disaster. The tough old bird groaned with all the extra weight, but managed to leave the sea again. As he lay back against a bulkhead, Smith gave a much-deserved sigh of relief. The P-47s were low on fuel and had to leave the scene. Gordon followed their path and had already put 10 miles between burning Kavieng and the trawler. Once again, a voice crackled over the PBY's radio, and announced that the Major had spotted another ditched B-25, only 600 yards off the beach. Gordon did not want to accept what he was hearing, and he began to calculate the mounting odds against surviving another rescue attempt with an already full hull. Gordon forced himself to stop his calculation. He would not leave any American behind, and that was that. Smith's relief turned into terror as he realized Traveler was executing a wide turn back toward Kavieng. For a second, the thought came to his head. Gordon was absolutely insane to put them all in such great peril. Then he realized he was letting fear overwhelm him. If it hadn't been for the deeds of this man, Smith and his crew would have been shark food by now. The Arkansas Traveler circled low over Kavieng Harbor, its shadow trailing over Japanese positions like a taunt. Nate Gordon gripped the controls of the battered PBY Catalina, guiding it toward Captain Cavoli's stranded crew. Smoke and fire scarred the shoreline as Gordon prepared for what would be his most dangerous landing yet, right under the noses of Japanese gunners. The Catalina hit the water hard, bow plates groaning with strain, but Gordon's precision brought him within yards of the survivors' rafts. There was no time for relief. Muzzle flashes erupted from the shoreline. Machine gun fire screamed across the water. The Traveler was a sitting duck, and every man aboard knew it. Shells flashed closer with each passing second. Gordon's hand wavered on the throttles, temptation clawing at him to escape while he still could. But the desperate men in the rafts, faces pale with fear, left him no choice. The crew hauled them aboard, dragging bodies weakened by exhaustion and terror. The starboard engine roared to life, coughing smoke into the sky. But the port engine, silent, useless. Gordon's blood ran cold. The Catalina spun wildly in the water, a sluggish target as the shoreline guns zeroed in. Shells buzzed so close they could feel the concussions. Co-pilot Ensign Walter Patrick slammed the starter button again and again. Gordon slapped Patrick's hand away, teeth gritted, quote, "It's flooded." Minutes bled into eternity as the Catalina spun in maddening circles. Finally, Patrick tried once more. The propellers twitched. Then, the blade spun to life. Gordon didn't hesitate. He jammed the throttles forward, forcing the overloaded Traveler across the waves. The engine screamed in protest. With Gordon, his crew of 7, and an impossible payload of 15 rescued aviators, the Arkansas Traveler defied gravity one last time. It was Gordon's 4th landing under hellish fire, but the enormity of their achievement only began to settle in as they climbed into Allied skies. 15 souls were pulled from the abyss. The cabin buzzed with nervous energy, relief washing over jittering hands and faces. Cigarettes trembled between lips. Gordon held his focused demeanor. His task wasn't over until those men were delivered to base. At Finschhafen, Navy medical corpsmen swarmed the Catalina, pulling the wounded to safety. Smith, his face burned and his leg torn open, fought to stay with his crew, but was forced to remain for treatment. The next morning, a Navy Seabee handed Smith a bowl of ice cream, which was his first taste in months. It felt surreal. Nathan Gordon's heroism did not go unnoticed. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his unmatched courage and skill, the only PBY pilot to receive it during World War II, and the first Navy man in the Southwest Pacific to earn the distinction. Admiral William F. Halsey himself praised the feat, quote, "This rescue was truly one of the most remarkable feats of the war." Despite the victory, the raid on Kavieng had been a costly affair. Allied aircraft littered the seas, but the fearless pilots had achieved their purpose. The Japanese stronghold was crippled, clearing the way for the invasion of the Admiralty Islands and another step toward final victory in the Pacific.